Hello, everyone. This is Steve Sirheinrich with Curvo, and I've got the pleasure to get a chance to talk with Stan Mendenhall. Stan is the publisher and editor of Orthopedic Network News, the president of Orthopedic Network News also, and they are a subsidiary of Curvo. And I get to work with Stan every day, and it's a lot of fun. And he's just released the Spine edition, came out at the end of October of Orthopedic Network News. The Spine edition comes out annually, and it's usually in October. So here we are, early November. Stan, I've got him on the line, and he's going to run through the highlights, the take-home messages, as he says, about this issue. So I encourage everyone here to, of course, read the issue, check it out. There's a lot of good content. But if you only have time, 10 or 15 minutes right now, to just get the highlights. That's why we're doing this call and recording it so that you can take that. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Stan Mendenhall and hand over the presentation to him. Go ahead, Stan.
Thanks very much, Steve. As Steve mentioned, that we have published the Orthopedic Network News in October on spine, and this is the table of contents. It's been roughly the same table of contents for the last number of years, where we do an overall survey of how many fusion procedures are being performed in the United States. We have an editorial. We look at the spine industry. We look at market shares and what's trending on that. And then we look at a profile of the hospital programs. And to me, this is very interesting because we get to look at the data that's sent to us by all the hospitals that participate in our various services and find out what the trends are and how spinal cases are being treated. We have a spinal implant price comparison, which is a limited number of implants that we have average selling prices on from the hospitals that send data to us. Since biologics are so concentrated in spine, we do a section on that, and bone cement as well. We have the fiscal year 2019 Medicare update and what their payment regs are, and then finally ortho trends, where we look at a lot of the same data, but we look at it on a quarterly rather than annual basis because there are trends that show up quarterly that people are very interested in. What I'm presenting are some of the highlights from the various stories because a lot of the information is fairly similar from year to year, but every year there are some differences. Now, this is one that we've monitored for a number of years, which shows the top manufacturers for spinal implants in the United States, which are Medtronic, Software Danek, DePuy Synthes, NuVasive, Stryker, and so on and so forth. And at the bottom is a chart that shows the market share of the joint manufacturers, the trauma manufacturers, the spine manufacturers, the top five. And you can see that for the top five in joints have been about 93% for the number of years. Trauma has hovered between 87, 85%. But spine, there's been an erosion of the top five vendors because there's been so many new entrants into the market. And anybody who manages a spine program knows that there's just a tremendous number of vendors are available that are selling product. It's very hard to keep track of them. This is a profile from the hospitals that send data to us. And again, the spend is concentrated in lumbar and cervical fusions. There's some VCF, vertebral compression, fracture repair, and others. The lumbar fusions averaged 12,102 per case, and that includes instruments, implants, biologics, and everything. And cervical was 5,014 per case in 2018 H1, which is January through June. The next slide shows what the distribution of costs are for lumbar fusions. And the thing that I've heard from a lot of hospitals is the growth and the difficulty of managing biologics. And you can see that biologics take up 25% of the cost of lumbar fusions, up from 23% a couple of years ago. Metals are up a little bit. Interbody fusion devices are down, and other is down as a percentage of the total cost. The thing on interbody, which is very interesting because interbody is the second largest segment in spine after metals, is that peak interbody fusion devices seem to have peaked in 2014. And they've been displaced by metal. Now, metal was some of the early interbody fusion devices, but peak rose to take over from bone. And you can see that bone accounts for less than 2% of the interbody fusion devices for lumbar and 23% in cervical. One thing that we've been very interested in, and it's very, very difficult to get good data on this, is intraoperative neuro monitoring. And if you watch the spine industry, there's been a number of acquisitions of neuromonitoring companies. Companies that very often employ a neurologist to provide intraoperative neuromonitoring during spine fusion cases to avoid impacts on the spinal cord when surgeons are doing their work. Since NuVasive has been the dominant player on supplies in this really doesn't tell us what all the other service providers are, and this is very difficult to get handles on. We estimated that 7% of the lumbar fusions use neuromonitoring. I suspect it's probably higher than that, but I really don't know. The cost of the supplies that we identified as neuromonitoring supplies were about $1,566 per case. And you can see it's been about the same for the last couple of years. And again, NuVasive and Software Organic have supplies that are specifically designed for neuromonitoring. Bone grafts and bone substitutes, this is something that we roll into the spine issue. We keep struggling with the term, whether it's orthobiologics, osteobiologics, biologics, whatever. The devices or the products we look at are predominantly used in spine, about 94%, whereas recon, which are hips and knees, shoulders, and trauma are much, much less. And on the right, you can see that lumbar fusion, 76% of the lumbar fusion cases used the osteobiologic or bone substitute, DBM, or bone morphogenic protein. And cervical fusions were about 58%. So when you're looking at the use of biologics, it's obviously going to include spine surgeons in that discussion. One of the things that we've looked at, and I sort of sense a frustration both on hospitals and the physicians, is that the biologics have become very, very sophisticated, and I question how many of the physicians really understand the difference between one type and another. And the tendency is often just to use belt and suspenders. It's like if we use one biologic, that's not as good as using 2 or 3 or 4, and hence, the costs go up. And for instance, here's an example of 30% of the lumbar fusion cases in our sample used just bone morphogenic protein, but 53% used BMP plus one other one, 16% used BMP plus 2, 1% used BMP plus 3 different biologics, and one case had BMP plus 4. So you can see that the costs go up as you add more product, and is there really any benefit to the patient? And that's something that we haven't seen an awful lot discussion on. And one of the things that I attended a meeting a few years ago where they talked about, especially in recon, this may not be true in spine so much, but in recon, basically when you have a huge bone void from a trauma or from a revision surgery, you need to fill it with as cheap as possible. And what's happened is that with all the biologics, you can use things like allograft bone, which only cost, in our sample, $18 per cubic centimeter, or you can go all the way up to a cell-based matrix, which is $350 per cc. Obviously, the actions of the cell-based matrix will be quite a bit different from the allograft bone, but this is one of the things that we've started looking at is the cost per cc for some of these products. Next is antibiotic bone cement. We did a survey on that. And in 2014 or 13, it looks like the usage of antibiotic bone cement peaked at about 54% of the units sold. And it's been going down every year ever since. And I think that's because of the awareness of the physicians that antibiotic bone cement is a lot more expensive. There's some questions of the value, and a lot of them are doing their own mixing. They're using vancomycin powder and mixing with Simplex or something that's much cheaper and getting the same result. The overall spend is skewed much higher on antibiotic bone cement than non-antibiotic, even though antibiotic is much fewer units. So that just reflects the cost per case difference. The next thing is that we looked at the trends in different types of constructs for knees. And the thing that we've read about and we've seen in our data now is the growth in cementless or coated knees. And these are things like Strykers come out with a number that are cementless knees. And I think I read a report that 24% of their cementless knees, or I'm sorry, 24% of their knees were cementless now. And you can see between Q2 2017 and Q2 2018 overall for all categories, not just Stryker, the percentage that were coated or cementless went from 5.2 up to 7.1%. So this is a trend. Economically, you can see the coated knees are more expensive and the costs are going up than the uncoated knees. So when you're doing your negotiations or contracting, you have to be aware that that's where the push is coming. Finally, this is a trend that somebody pointed out to us earlier, that everybody has seen that ceramic heads have taken over as the dominant type of hip system. We're using ceramic heads as opposed to metal heads, and everybody knows ceramic heads are more expensive. And we've seen for the last 2 quarters that the percentage of total hips with ceramic heads has actually gone down. Now, I'm not sure that's a trend, whether it's an artifact in our data, but it's something we're going to pay attention to. So at this point, these are the highlights for our newsletter that just came out. And at this point, I'll turn it back over to Steve and let him talk about how to talk to us more.
Thanks, Stan. This was really great. And I know you just hit the highlights. There's 28 pages in this spine edition. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah, so there's a lot of meat inside there, a lot of insights, writings, editorial. So I wanted to just let everybody know, if you're interested in this issue, you can purchase a single issue or you can get a subscription, and you can contact me, steve@curvolabs.com. We'll soon be setting up an online self-serve subscription portal, but for now, just contact me. Of course, if you have any questions, contact Stan about this content. I know Stan's open and ready to, available to talk about it at any time. So Stan, thanks a lot for taking the time to do this, and I appreciate the work you're doing. So have a great rest of your day, everyone.